Peter Egon Momus was doing them a great honour. Peter Egon Momus was deigning to share with them his visions for the new high city. Peter Egon Momus, architect designate for the 63rd expedition, was unveiling his preparatory ideas for the transformation of the conquered city into a permanent memorial to glory and compliance. The trouble was, Peter Egon Momus was just a figure in the distance and largely inaudible. In the gathered audience, in the dusty heat, Ignace Carcasses shifted impatiently and craned his neck to see. The assembly had been gathered in a city square north of the palace. It was just after midday, and the sun was at its zenith, scorching the bare basalt towers and yards of the city. Though the high walls around the square offered some shade, the air was oven-dry and stiflingly hot. There was a breeze, but even that was heated like exhaust vapour, and it did nothing but stir up fine grit in the air. Powder dust, the particulate residue of the great battle, was everywhere, hazing the bright air like smoke. Carcass's throat was as arid as a riverbed in drought. Around him, people in the crowd coughed and sneezed. The crowd, 500 strong, had been carefully vetted. 3/4 of them were local dignitaries, grandees, nobles, merchants, members of the overthrown government, representatives of that part of 6319's ruling classes who had pledged compliance to the new order. They had been summoned by invitation so that they might participate, however superficially, in the renewal of their society. The rest were remembrances. Many of them, like Carcasses, had been granted their first transit permit to the surface, at long last, so they could attend. If this was what he had been waiting for, Carcasses thought, they could keep it. Standing in a crowded kiln while some old fart made incoherent noises in the background. The crowd seemed to share his mood. They were hot and despondent. Carcasses saw no smiles on the faces of the invited locals, just hard, drawn looks of forbearance. The choice between compliance or death didn't make compliance any more pleasurable. They were defeated, deprived of their culture and their way of life, facing a future determined by alien minds. They were simply, wearily, enduring the indignity of this period of transition into the imperium of man. From time to time they clapped in a desultory manner, but only when stirred up by the iterators carefully planted in their midst. The crowd had drawn up around the aprons of a metal stage erected for the event. Upon it were arranged hololithic screens and relief models of the city-to-be, as well as many of the extravagantly complex brass and steel surveying instruments Momus utilized in his work. Geared, spoked, and meticulous, the instruments suggested to Carcass's mind devices of torture. Torture was right. Momus, when he could be seen between the heads of the crowd, was a small, trim man with over-dainty mannerisms. As he explained his plans, the staff of iterators on stage with him aimed live pictures close up at relevant areas of the relief models, the images transferring directly to the screens, along with graphic schematics. But the sunlight was too glaring for decent hololithic projection, and the images were milked out and hard to comprehend. Something was wrong with the vox mic Momus was using, too, and what little of his speech came through served only to demonstrate the man had no gift whatsoever for public speaking. Always a Heliolithic city, a tribute to the sun above, and we may see this afternoon, indeed, I am sure you will have noticed, the glory of the light here. A city of light. Light out of darkness is a noble theme, by which, of course, I mean the light of truth, shining upon the darkness of ignorance. I am much taken with the local phototropic technologies I have found here, and intend to incorporate them into the design. Carcasses sighed. He never thought he would find himself wishing for an iterator, but at least those bastards knew how to speak in public. Peter Egon Momus should have left the talking to one of the iterators while he aimed the wretched pictor wand for them. His mind wandered. He looked up at the high walls around them, geometric slabs against the blue sky, baked pink in the sunlight, or smoke black where shadows slanted. He saw the scorch marks and dotted bolt craters that pitted the basalt like acne. Beyond the walls, the towers of the palace were in worse repair, their plasterwork hanging off like shed snakeskin, their missing windows like blinded eyes. In a yard to the south of the gathering, a titan of the mechanicum stood on station, its grim humanoid form rising up over the walls. It stood perfectly still, like a piece of monumental martial statuary, instantly installed. Now that, thought Carcassy, was a far more appropriate celebration of glory and compliance. Carcassy stared at the Titan for a little while. He'd never seen anything like it before in his life, except in Picts. The awesome sight of it almost made the tedious outing worthwhile. The more he stared at it, the more uncomfortable it made him feel. It was so huge, so threatening, and so very still. He knew it could move. He began to wish it would. He found himself yearning for it to suddenly turn its head or take a step or otherwise rumble into animation. Its immobility was agonizing. Then he began to fear that if it did suddenly move, he would be quite unmanned and might be forced to cry out in involuntary terror and fall to his knees. A burst of clapping made him jump. Momus had apparently said something apposite, and the iterators were stirring up the crowd in response. Carcassy slapped his sweaty hands together a few times, obediently. Carcassy was sick of it. He knew he couldn't bear to stand there much longer with the Titan staring at him. He took one last look at the stage. Momus was rambling on, well into his 50th minute. The only other point of interest to the whole affair, as far as Carcassy was concerned, stood at the back of the podium behind Momus. Two giants in yellow plate. Two noble Astartes from the 7th Legion, the Imperial Fists, the Emperor's Praetorians. They were presumably in attendance to lend Momus an appropriate air of authority. Carcassy guessed the 7th had been chosen over the Lunar Wolves because of their noted genius in the arts of fortification and defense. The Imperial Fists were fortress builders, warrior masons who raised such impenetrable redoubts that they could be held for eternity against any enemy. Carcassy smelled the artful handiwork of iterator propaganda, the architects of war watching over the architect of peace. Carcassy had waited to see if either would speak, or come forward to remark upon Momus's plans. But they did not. They stood there, bolters across their broad chests, as static and unwavering as the Titan. Carcassy turned away, and began to push his way out through the inflexible crowd. He headed towards the rear of the square. Troopers of the Imperial Army had been stationed around the hem of the crowd as a precaution. They had been required to wear full-dress uniform, and they were so overheated that their sweaty cheeks were blanched a sickly green-white. One of them noticed Carcassy moving out through the thinnest part of the audience and came over to him. "Where are you going, sir?" he asked. "I'm dying of thirst," Carcassy replied. "There will be refreshments, I'm told, after the presentation," the soldier said. His voice caught on the word refreshments, and Carcassy knew there would be none for the common soldiery. "Well, I've had enough," Carcassy said. "It's not over." "I've had enough." The soldier frowned. Perspiration beaded at the bridge of his nose, just beneath the rim of his heavy fur shako. His throat and jowls were flushed pink and sheened with sweat. "I can't allow you to wander away. Movement is supposed to be restricted to approved areas." Carcassy grinned wickedly. "And I thought you were here to keep trouble out, not keep us in." The soldier didn't find that funny, or even ironic. "We're here to keep you safe, sir," he said. "I'd like to see your permit." Carcassy took out his papers. They were an untidy, crumpled bundle, warm and damp from his trouser pocket. Carcassy waited, faintly embarrassed, while the soldier studied them. He had never liked barking up against authority, especially not in front of people, though the back of the crowd didn't seem to be at all interested in the exchange. "You're a remembrancer?" the soldier asked. "Yes. Poet," Carcassy added before the inevitable second question got asked. The soldier looked up from the papers into Carcassy's face, as if searching for some essential characteristic of poethood that might be discerned there, comparable to a navigator's third eye or a slave drone's serial tattoo. He'd likely never seen a poet before, which was all right, because Carcassy had never seen a Titan before. "You should stay here, sir," the soldier said, handing the papers back to Carcassy. "But this is pointless," Carcassy said. I have been sent to make a memorial of these events. I can't get close to anything. I can't even hear properly what that fool's got to say. Can you imagine the wrong-headedness of this? Momus isn't even history. He's just another kind of memorialist. I've been allowed here to remember his remembrance, and I can't even do that properly. I'm so far removed from the things I should be engaging with. I might as well have stayed on Terra and made do with a telescope. The soldier shrugged. He'd lost the thread of Carcasses' speech early on. You should stay here, sir, for your own safety. I was told the city had been made safe, Carcasses said. We're only a day or two from compliance, aren't we? The soldier leaned forward discreetly, so close that Carcasses could smell the stale odor of garbage the heat was infusing into his breath. Just between us, that's the official line, but there has been trouble. Insurgents. Loyalists. You always get it in a conquered city, no matter how clean the victory. The back streets are not secure. Really? They're saying loyalists, but it's just discontent, if you ask me. These bastards have lost it all, and they're not happy about it. Carcasses nodded. Thanks for the tip, he said, and turned back to rejoin the crowd. 5 minutes later, with Momus still droning on and Carcasses close to despair, an elderly noblewoman in the crowd fainted, and there was a small commotion. The soldiers hurried in to take charge of the situation and carry her into the shade. When the soldier's back was turned, Carcasses took himself off out of the square and into the streets beyond. He walked for a while through empty courts and high-walled streets where shadows pooled like water. The day's heat was still pitiless, but moving around made it more bearable. Periodic breezes gusted down alleyways, but they were not at all relieving. Most were so full of sand and grit that Carcasses had to turn his back to them and close his eyes until they abated. The streets were vacant, except for an occasional figure hunched in the shadows of a doorway or half visible behind broken shutters. He wondered if anybody would respond if he approached them, but felt reluctant to try. The silence was penetrating, and to break it would have felt as improper as disturbing a morning vigil. He was alone, properly alone for the first time in over a year, a master of his own actions. It felt tremendously liberating. He could go where he pleased, and quickly began to exercise that privilege, taking street turns at random, walking where his feet took him. For a while he kept the still unmoving Titan in sight, as a point of reference, but it was soon eclipsed by towers and high roofs, so he resigned himself to getting lost. Getting lost would be liberating too. There were always the great towers of the palace. He could follow those back to their roots if necessary. War had ravaged many parts of the city he passed through. Buildings had toppled into white and dusty heaps of slag, or been reduced to their very basements. Others were roofless, or burned out, or wounded in their structures, or simply rendered into facades, their innards blown out, standing like the wooden flats of stage scenery. Craters and shell holes pockmarked certain pavements, or the surfaces of metalled roads, sometimes forming strange rows and patterns, as if their arrangement was deliberate or concealed by some secret code, great truths of life and death. There was a smell in the dry, hot air, like burning, or blood, or ordure. Yet none of those things. A mingled scent. An after scent. It wasn't burning he could smell. It was things burnt. It wasn't blood. It was dry residue. It wasn't ordure. It was the seeping consequence of sewer systems broken and cracked by the bombardment. Many streets had stacks of belongings piled up along the pavements. Furniture, bundles of clothing, kitchenware. A great deal of it was in disrepair, and had evidently been recovered from ruined dwellings. Other piles seemed more intact, the items carefully packed in trunks and coffers. People were intending to quit the city, he realized. They had piled up their possessions in readiness while they tried to procure transportation, or perhaps the relevant permission from the occupying authorities. Almost every street and yard bore some slogan or other notice upon its walls. All were handwritten, in a great variety of styles and degrees of calligraphic skill. Some were daubed in pitch, others paint or dye, others chalk or charcoal. The latter, Carcasses reasoned, marks made by the employment of burnt sticks and splinters taken from the ruins. Many were indecipherable or unfathomable. Many were bold, angry graffiti, splenetically cursing the invaders or defiantly announcing a surviving spark of resistance. They called for death, for uprising, for revenge. Others were lists, carefully recording the names of the citizens who had died in that place, or plaintive requests for news about the missing loved ones listed below. Others were agonized statements of lament, or minutely and delicately transcribed texts of some sacred significance. Carcassy found himself increasingly captivated by them, by the variation and contrast of them, and the emotions they conveyed. For the first time, the first true and proper time since he'd left Terra, he felt the poet in him respond. This feeling excited him. He had begun to fear that he might have accidentally left his poetry behind on Terra in his hurry to embark, or at least that it malingered, folded and unpacked, in his quarters on the ship, like his least favourite shirt. He felt the muse return, and it made him smile, despite the heat and the mummification of his throat. It seemed apt, after all, that it should be words that brought words back into his mind. He took out his chapbook and his pen. He was a man of traditional inclinations, believing that no great lyric could ever be composed on the screen of a data slate, a point of variance that had almost got him into a fist-fight with Palisade Hadre, the other poet of note amongst the Remembrancer group. That had been near the start of their conveyance to join the expedition, during one of the informal dinners held to allow the Remembrancers to get to know one another. He would have won the fight, if it had come to it. He was fairly sure of that, even though Hadre was an especially large and fierce woman. Carcassy favoured notebooks of thick cream cartridge paper, and at the start of his long, fated career had sourced a supplier in one of Terra's Arctic hives, who specialised in antique methods of paper manufacture. The firm was called Bondsman, and it offered a particularly pleasing quarto chapbook of 50 leaves, bound in a case of soft black kid, with an elasticated strap to keep it closed. The Bondsman No. 7. Carcassy, a sallow, raw-headed youth back then, had paid a significant proportion of his first royalty income for an order of 200. The volumes had come, packed head to toe, in a waxed box lined with tissue paper, which had smelled, to him at least, of genius and potential. He had used the books sparingly, leaving not one precious page unfilled before starting a new one. As his fame grew and his earnings soared, he had often thought about ordering another box, but always stopped when he realized he had over half the original shipment still to use up. All his great works had been composed upon the pages of Bondsman No. 7s. His Fanfare to Unity, all 11 of his imperial cantos, his ocean poems, even the meritorious much republished Reflections and Odes, written in his 30th year, which had secured his reputation and won him the Ethiopic laureate. The year before his selection to the role of Remembrancer, after what had been, in all fairness, a decade of unproductive doldrums that had seen him living off past glories, he had decided to rejuvenate his muse by placing an order for another box. He had been dismayed to discover that Bondsman had ceased operation. Ignace Carcassy had 9 unused volumes left in his possession. He had brought them all with him on the voyage. But for an idiot scribble or two, their pages were unmarked. On a blazing, dusty street corner in the broken city, he took the chapbook out of his coat pocket and slid off the strap. He found his pen, an antique plunger-action fountain, for his traditionalist tastes applied as much to the means of marking as what should be marked, and began to write. The heat had almost congealed the ink in his nib, but he wrote anyway, copying out such pieces of wall writing as affected him, sometimes attempting to duplicate the manner and form of their delineation. He recorded 1 or 2 at first, as he moved from street to street, and then became more inclusive, and began to mark down almost every slogan he saw. It gave him satisfaction and delight to do this. He could feel, quite definitely, a lyric beginning to form, taking shape from the words he read and recorded. It would be superlative. After years of absence, the muse had flown back into his soul, as if it had never been away. He realized he had lost track of time. Though it was still stifling hot and bright, the hour was late, and the blazing sun had worked its way over, lower in the sky. He had filled almost 20 pages, almost half his chapbook. He felt a sudden pang. What if he only had 9 volumes of genius left in him? What if that box of Bondsman No. 7s, delivered so long ago, represented the creative limits of his career? He shuddered, chilled despite the clinging heat, and put his chapbook and pen away. He was standing on a lonely war-scabbed street corner, persecuted by the sun, unable to fathom which direction to turn. For the first time since escaping Peter Egon Murmus's presentation, Carcassy felt afraid. He felt that eyes were watching him from the blind ruins. He began to retrace his steps, slouching through gritty shadow and dusty light. Only once or twice did a new graffito persuade him to stop and take out his chapbook again. He'd been walking for some time, in circles probably, for all the streets had begun to look the same, when he found the eating house. It occupied the ground floor and basement of a large basalt tenement, and bore no sign, but the smell of cooking announced its purpose. Door shutters had been opened onto the street, and there was a handful of tables set out. For the first time he saw people in numbers. Locals in dark sun cloaks and shawls, as unresponsive and indolent as the few souls he had glimpsed in doorways. They were sitting at the tables under a tattered awning, alone or in small silent groups, drinking thimble glasses of liquor or eating food from finger bowls. Carcassy remembered the state of his throat, and his belly remembered itself with a groan. He walked inside, into the shade, nodding politely to the patrons. None responded. In the cold gloom he found a wooden bar with a dresser behind it, laden with glassware and spouted bottles. The hostel keeper, an old woman in a khaki wrap, eyed him suspiciously from behind the serving counter. "Hello," he said. She frowned back. "Do you understand me?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "That's good. Very good. I had been told our languages were largely the same, but that there were some accent and dialect differences." He trailed off. The old woman said something that might have been "what?" or might have been any number of curses or interrogatives. "You have food?" he asked. Then he mimed eating. She continued to stare at him. "Food?" he asked. She replied with a flurry of guttural words, none of which he could make out. Either she didn't have food, or was unwilling to serve him, or she didn't have any food for the likes of him. "Something to drink, then?" he asked. No response. He mimed drinking, and when that brought nothing, pointed at the bottles behind her. She turned and took down one of the glass containers, selecting one as if he had indicated it directly instead of generally. It was 3/4 full of a clear, oily fluid that roiled in the gloom. She thumped it onto the counter and then put a thimble glass beside it. "Very good," he smiled. "Very, very good. Well done. Is this local?" "Of course it is. Of course it is. A local speciality. You're not going to tell me, are you? Because you have no idea what I'm actually saying, have you?" She stared blankly at him. He picked up the bottle and poured a measure into the glass. The liquor flowed as slowly and heavily through the spout as his ink had done from his pen in the street. He put the bottle down and lifted the glass, toasting her. "Your health," he said brightly, "and to the prosperity of your world. I know things are hard now, but trust me, this is all for the best. All for the very best." He swigged the drink. It tasted of licorice, and went down very well, heating his dry gullet and lighting a buzz in his gut. "Excellent," he said, and poured himself a second. "Very good indeed. You're not going to answer me, are you? I could ask your name and your lineage and anything at all, and you would just stand there like a statue, wouldn't you? Like a titan." He sank the second glass and poured a third. He felt very good about himself now, better than he had done for hours, better even than when the muse had flown back to him in the streets. In truth, Drink had always been a more welcome companion to Ignace Carcassy than any muse, though he would never have been willing to admit it, or to admit the fact that his affection for drink had long weighed down his career, like rocks in a sack. Drink and his muse, both beloved of him, each pulling in opposite directions. He drank his third glass and tipped out a fourth. Warmth infused him, a biological warmth much more welcome than the brutal heat of the day. It made him smile. It revealed to him how extraordinary this false terror was, how complex and intoxicating. He felt love for it, and pity, and tremendous goodwill. This world, this place, this hostelry would not be forgotten. Suddenly remembering something else, he apologized to the old woman, who had remained facing him across the counter like a fugued servitor, and reached into his pocket. He had currency, imperial coin, and plastic wafers. He made a pile of them on the stained and glossy bar top. "Imperial," he said. "But you take that. I mean, you're obliged to. I was told that by the iterators this morning. Imperial currency is legal tender now, to replace your local coin." "Tara, you don't know what I'm saying, do you? How much do I owe you?" No answer. He sipped his fourth drink and pushed the pile of cash towards her. "You decide, then. You tell me. Take for the whole bottle." He tapped the finger against the side of the flask. "The whole bottle? How much?" He grinned and nodded at the money. The old woman looked at the heap, reached out a bony hand and picked up a 5 Aquila piece. She studied it for a moment, then spat on it and threw it at Carcassy. The coin bounced off his belly and fell onto the floor. Carcassy blinked and then laughed. The laughter boomed out of him, hard and joyous, and he was quite unable to keep it in. The old woman stared at him. Her eyes widened ever so slightly. Carcassy lifted up the bottle and the glass. "I tell you what," he said. "Keep it all. All of it." He walked away and found an empty table in the corner of the place. He sat down and poured another drink, looking about him. Some of the silent patrons were staring at him. He nodded back, cheerfully. They looked so human, he thought, and realized it was a ridiculous thing to think, because they were without a doubt human. But at the same time they weren't. Their drab clothes, their drab manner, the set of their features, their way of sitting and looking and eating, they seemed a little like animals, man-shaped creatures trained to ape human behavior, yet not quite accomplished in that art. "Is that what 5,000 years of separation does to a species?" he asked aloud. No one answered, and some of his watchers turned away. Was that what 5,000 years did to the divided branches of mankind? He took another sip. Biologically identical, but for a few strands of genetic inheritance, and yet culturally grown so far apart. These were men who lived and walked and drank and shat just as he did. They lived in houses and raised cities and wrote upon walls and even spoke the same language, old women notwithstanding. Yet time and division had grown them along alternate paths. Carcassy saw that clearly now. They were a graft from the rootstock, grown under another sun, similar yet alien. Even the way they sat at tables and sipped at drinks. Carcassy stood up suddenly. The muse had abruptly jostled the pleasure of drink out of the summit of his mind. He bowed to the old woman as he collected up his glass and 2/3 empty bottle and said, "My thanks, madam." Then he teetered back out into the sunlight. He found a vacant lot a few streets away that had been levelled to rubble by bombing, and perched himself on a chunk of basalt. Setting down the bottle and the glass carefully, he took out his half-filled Bondsman No. 7 and began to write again, forming the first few stanzas of a lyric that owed much to the writings on the walls and the insight he had garnered in the hostelry. It flowed well for a while, and then dried up. He took another drink, trying to restart his inner voice. Tiny black ant-like insects milled industriously in the rubble around him, as if trying to rebuild their own miniature lost city. He had to brush one off the open page of his chapbook. Others raced exploratively over the toe-caps of his boots in a frenetic expedition. He stood up, imagining itches, and decided this wasn't a place to sit. He gathered up his bottle and his glass, taking another sip once he'd fished out the ant floating in it with his finger. A building of considerable size and magnificence faced him across the damaged lot. He wondered what it was. He stumbled over the rubble towards it, almost losing his footing on the loose rock from time to time. What was it? A municipal hall? A library? A school? He wandered around it, admiring the fine rise of the walls and the decorated headers of the stonework. Whatever it was, the building was important. Miraculously, it had been spared the destruction visited on its neighbouring lots. Carcassy found the entrance, a towering arch of stone filled with copper doors. They weren't locked. He pushed his way in. The interior of the building was so profoundly and refreshingly cool it almost made him gasp. It was a single space, an arched roof raised on massive ouse-like pillars, the floor dressed in cold onyx. Under the end windows some kind of stone structure rose. Carcassy paused. He put down his bottle beside the base of one of the pillars and advanced down the centre of the building with his glass in his hand. He knew there was a word for a place like this. He searched for it. Sunlight, filleted by coloured glass, slanted through the thin windows. The stone structure at the end of the chamber was a carved lectern supporting a very massive and very old book. Carcassy touched the crinkled parchment of the book's open pages with delight. It appealed to him the same way as the pages of a Bondsman No. 7 did. The sheets were old and faded, covered with ornate black script and hand-coloured images. This was an altar, he realized. This place, a temple, a fane. "Terror alive!" he declared, and then winced as his words echoed back down the cool vault. History had taught him about fanes and religious belief, but he had never before set foot inside such a place of spirits and divinity. He sensed that the spirits were looking down on his intrusion with disapproval, and then laughed at his own idiocy. There were no spirits, not anywhere in the cosmos. Imperial truth had taught him that. The only spirits in this building were the ones in his glass and his belly. He looked at the pages again. Here was the truth of it, the crucial mark of difference between his breed of man and the local variety. They were heathens. They continued to embrace the superstitions that the fundamental strand of mankind had set aside. Here was the promise of an afterlife and an ethereal world. Here was the nonsense of a faith in the intangible. Carcassy knew that there were some, many perhaps, amongst the population of the compliant imperium who longed for a return to those ways. God, in every incarnation and pantheon, was long perished, but still men hankered after the ineffable. Despite prosecution, new credos and budding religions were sprouting up amongst the cultures of unified man. Most vigorous of all was the imperial creed that insisted humanity adopt the emperor as a divine being, a god-emperor of mankind. The idea was ludicrous and, officially, heretical. The emperor had always refused such adoration in the most stringent terms, denying his apotheosis. Some said it would only happen after his death, and as he was functionally immortal, that tended to cap the argument. Whatever his powers, whatever his capacity, whatever his magnificence as the finest and most gloriously total leader of the species, he was still just a man. The emperor liked to remind mankind of this whenever he could. It was an edict that rattled around the bureaucracies of the expanding imperium. The emperor is the emperor, and he is great and everlasting, but he is not a god, and he refuses any worship offered to him. Carcassy took a swig and put his empty thimble glass down at an angle on the edge of the lectern shelf. The Lectitio Divinitatis. That's what it was called. The missile of the underground wellspring that strove in secret to establish the cult of the emperor against his will. It was said that even some of the upstanding members of the Council of Terror supported its aims. The Emperor as God. Carcassy stifled a laugh. 5,000 years of blood, war, and fire to expunge all gods from the culture, and now the man who achieved that goal supplants them as a new deity. How foolish is mankind! Carcassy laughed, enjoying the way his words echoed around the empty fane. How desperate and flailing! Is it that we simply need a concept of God to fulfill us? Is that part of our make-up? He fell silent, considering the point he had raised to himself. A good point. Well reasoned. He wondered where his bottle had gone. It was a good point. Maybe that was mankind's ultimate weakness. Maybe it was one of humanity's basic impulses, the need to believe in another higher order. Perhaps faith was like a vacuum, sucking up credulity in a frantic effort to fill its own void. Perhaps it was a part of mankind's genetic character to need, to hunger for, a spiritual solace. Perhaps we are cursed, Carcassy told the empty fane, to crave something which does not exist. There are no gods, no spirits, no demons, so we make them up to comfort ourselves. The fane seemed oblivious to his ramblings. He took hold of his empty glass and wandered back to where he had left the bottle. Another drink. He left the fane and threaded his way out into the blinding sunlight. The heat was so intense that he had to take another swig. Carcassy wobbled down a few streets, away from the temple, and heard a rushing, roasting noise. He discovered a team of imperial soldiers, stripped to the waist, using a flamer to erase anti-imperial slogans from a wall. They had evidently been working their way down the street, for all the walls displayed swathes of heat burns. "Don't do that," he said. The soldiers turned and looked at him, their flamer spitting. From his garments and demeanor, he was unmistakably not a local. "Don't do that," he said again. "Orders, sir," said one of the troopers. "What are you doing out here?" asked another. Carcassy shook his head and left them alone. He trudged through narrow alleys and open courts, sipping from the spout of the bottle. He found another vacant lot very similar to the one he had sat down in before, and placed his rump upon a scalene block of basalt. He took out his chapbook and ran through the stanzas he had written. They were terrible. He groaned as he read them, then became angry and tore the precious pages out. He balled the thick cream paper up and tossed it away into the rubble. Carcassy suddenly became aware that eyes were staring at him from the shadows of doorways and windows. He could barely make out their shapes, but knew full well that locals were watching him. He got up and quickly retrieved the balls of crumpled paper he had discarded, feeling that he had no right to add in any way to the mess. He began to hurry down the street as thin boys emerged from hiding to lob stones and jeers after him. He found himself, unexpectedly, in the street of the hostelry again. It was uninhabited, but he was pleased to have found it, as his bottle had become unaccountably empty. He went into the gloom. There was no one around. Even the old woman had disappeared. His pile of imperial currency lay where he had left it on the counter. Seeing it, he felt authorized to help himself to another bottle from behind the bar. Clutching the bottle in his hand, he very carefully sat down at one of the tables and poured another drink. He had been sitting there for an indefinite amount of time when a voice asked him if he was all right. Ignis Carcassy blinked and looked up. The gang of Imperial army troops, who had been burning clean the walls of the city, had entered the hostelry, and the old woman had reappeared to fetch them drinks and food. The officer looked down at Carcassy as his men took their seats. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked. Yes, yes, Carcassy slurred. "You don't look all right, pardon me for saying. Should you be out in the city?" Carcassy nodded furiously, tucking into his pocket for his permit. It wasn't there. "I meant to be here," he said instead. "Meant to. I was ordered to come. To hear Peter Egon Momus present his plans for the new city. That's why I'm here. I'm meant to be. The officer regarded him cautiously. If you say so, sir. They say Momus has drawn up a wonderful scheme for the reconstruction. Oh, yes, quite wonderful, Carcassy replied, reaching for his bottle and missing. Quite bloody wonderful. An eternal memorial to our victory here. Sir? It won't last, Carcassy said. No, it won't last. It can't. Nothing lasts. You look like a wise man to me, friend. What do you think? I think you should be on your way, sir, the officer said gently. No. About the city. The city. It won't last. Terror take Peter Egon Momus to the dust. All things return. As far as I can see, this city was pretty wonderful before we came and hobbled it. Sir, I think... No, you don't, Carcassy said, shaking his head. You don't. And no one does. This city was supposed to last forever, but we broke it and laid it in tatters. Let Momus rebuild it. It will happen again. And again. The work of man is destined to perish. Momus said he plans a city that will celebrate mankind forever. You know what? I bet that's what the architects who built this place thought too. Sir? What man does comes apart eventually. You mark my words. This city, Momus's city, the imperium. Sir, you... Carcassy rose to his feet, blinking and wagging a finger. Don't sir me. The imperium will fall asunder as soon as we construct it. You mark my words, it's as inevitable as... Pain abruptly splintered Carcassy's face, and he fell down, bewildered. He registered a frenzy of shouting and movement, then felt boots and fists slamming into him over and over again. Enraged by his words, the troopers had fallen upon him. Shouting, the officer tried to pull them off. Bones snapped. Blood spurted from Carcassy's nostrils. Mark my words, he coughed. Nothing we build will last forever. You ask these bloody locals. A boot cap cracked into his sternum. Bloody fluid washed into his mouth. Get off him! Get off him! The officer was yelling, trying to rein in his provoked and angry men. By the time he managed to do so, Ignis Carcassy was no longer pontificating, or breathing. 6. Torgadon was waiting for him in the towering antehall behind the strategium. There you are, he grinned. Here I am, Loken agreed. There will be a question, Torgadon remarked, keeping his voice low. It will seem a minor thing, and will not be obviously directed to you, but be ready to catch it. Me? No, I was talking to myself. Yes, you, Garville. Consider it a baptismal test. Come on! Loken didn't like the sound of Torgadon's words, but he appreciated the warning. He followed Torgadon down the length of the antehall. It was a perilously tall, narrow place, with embossed columns of wood set into the walls that soared up and branched like carved trees to support a glass roof 200 meters above them, through which the stars could be seen. Dark wood panels cased the walls between the columns, and they were covered with millions of lines of hand-painted names and numbers, all rendered in exquisite gilt lettering. They were the names of the dead, all those of the legions, the army, the fleet, and the Divisio Militaris, who had fallen since the start of the Great Crusade, in actions where this flagship vessel had been present. The names of immortal heroes were limned here on the walls, grouped in columns below header legends that proclaimed the world sites of famous actions and hallowed conquests. From this display, the antehall earned its particular name, the Avenue of Glory and Lament. The walls of fully 2/3 of the antehall were filled up with golden names. As the two striding captains in their glossy white plate drew closer to the strategium end, The wall boards became bare, unoccupied. They passed a group of hooded necrologists, huddled by the last half-filled panel, who were carefully stenciling new names onto the dark wood with gold-dipped brushes. The latest dead. The roll call from the high city battle. The necrologists stopped work and bowed their heads as the two captains went by. Abaddon didn't spare them a second glance, but Loken turned to read the half-written names. Some of them were brothers from Loken he would never see again. He could smell the tangy oil suspension of the gold leaf the necrologists were using. "Keep up," Abaddon grunted. High doors, lacquered gold and crimson, stood closed at the end of the avenue hall. Before them, Aximand and Abaddon were waiting. They were likewise fully armoured, their heads bare, their brush-crested helms held under their left arms. Abaddon's great white shoulder plates were draped with a black wolf pelt. "Garville?" he smiled. "It doesn't do to keep him waiting," Aximand grumbled. Loken wasn't sure if little Horus meant Abaddon or the commander. "What were you two gabbing about? Like fishwives, the pair of you." "I was just asking him if he'd settled Viper's Inn," Abaddon said simply. Aximand glanced at Loken, his wide-set eyes languidly half-hooded by his lids. "And I was reassuring Tarek that I had," Loken added. Evidently, Abaddon's quiet heads-up had been for his ears only. "Let's enter," Abaddon said. He raised his gloved hand and pushed the gold and crimson doors wide. A short processional lay before them, a 20-metre colonnade of ebon stone chased with a fretwork of silver wire. It was lined by 40 guardsmen of the Imperial Army, members of Varvarus's own Byzant Janizars, 20 against each wall. They were splendidly appointed in full dress uniforms, long cream greatcoats with gold frogging, high-crowned chrome helms with basket visors and scarlet cockades, and matching sashes. As the Mournival came through the doors, the Janizars brandished their ornate power lances, beginning with the pair directly inside the doorway. The polished blades of the weapons whirled up into place in series, like chasing dominoes along the processional, each facing pair of weapons locking into position just before the marching captains caught up with the ripple. The final pair came to salute, eyes front, in perfect discipline, and the Mournival stepped past them onto the deck of the strategium. The strategium was a great semicircular platform that projected like a lip out above the tiered theatre of the flagship's bridge. Far below lay the principal command level, thronging with hundreds of uniformed personnel and burnished aid servitors, tiny as ants. To either side, the beehive subdecks of the secondary platforms, dressed in gold and black ironwork, rose up, past the level of the projecting strategium, up into the roof itself, each story busy with Navy staff, operators, cogitation officers, and astropaths. The front section of the bridge chamber was a great strutted window, through which the constellations and the ink of space could be witnessed. The standards of the lunar wolves and the imperial fists hung from the arching roof, either side of the staring eye banner of the War Master himself. That great banner was marked in golden thread with the decree, "I am the Emperor's vigilance and the Eye of Terror." Loken remembered the award of that august symbol with pride during the great triumph after Ulanor was done. In all his decades of service, Loken had only been on the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit twice before. Once to formally accept his promotion to captain, and then again to mark his elevation to the captaincy of the 10th. The scale of the place took his breath away, as it had done both times before. The strategium deck itself was an ironwork platform which supported, at its centre, a circular dais of plain, unfinished auslight, 1 metre deep and 10 in diameter. The commander had always eschewed any form of throne or seat. The ironwork walk space around the dais was half-shadowed by the overhang of tiered galleries that climbed the slopes of the chamber behind it. Glancing up, Loken saw huddles of senior iterators, tacticians, ship captains of the expedition fleet, and other notables gathering to view the proceedings. He looked for Sinderman, but couldn't find his face. Several attendant figures stood quietly around the edges of the dais. Lord Commander Hector Varvarus, Marshal of the expedition's army, a tall, precise aristocrat in red robes, stood discussing the content of a data slate with two formally uniformed army aides. Boas Comnenus, master of the fleet, waited, drumming steel fingers on the edge of the Auslight plinth. He was a squat bear of a man, his ancient flaccid body encased in a superb silver and steel exoskeleton, further draped in robes of deep, rich Selpic blue. Neatly machined ocular lenses whirred and exchanged in the augmetic frame that supplanted his long-dead eyes. Ing Mei Sing, the expedition's mistress of astropaths, stood to the master's left, a gaunt, blind spectre in a hooded white gown, and, round from her, in order, the High Senior of the Navis Nobilitae, Navigator Chirogus, the Master Companion of Vox, the Master Companion of Lucidation, the Senior Tacticae, the Senior Heraldists, and various gubernatorial legates. Each one, Loken noticed, had placed a single personal item on the edge of the dais where they stood. A glove, a cap, a wand stave. "We stay in the shadows," Torgadon told him, bringing Loken up short under the edge of the shade cast by the balcony above. "This is the Mournival's place. Apart, yet present." Loken nodded and remained with Torgadon and Aximand in the symbolic shadow of the overhang. Abaddon stepped forward into the light and took his place at the edge of the dais between Varvarus, who nodded pleasantly to him, and Comnenus, who didn't. Abaddon placed his helm upon the edge of the Auslight disk. "An item placed on the dais registers a desire to be heard and noted," Torgadon told Loken. "Ezekiel has a place by dint of his status as first captain. For now he will speak as first captain, not as the Mournival." "Will I get the hang of this ever?" Loken asked. "No, not at all," Torgadon said. Then he grinned. "Yes, you will. Of course you will." Loken noticed another figure, removed from the main assembly. The man, if it were a man, lurked at the rail of the strategium deck, gazing out across the chasm of the bridge. He was a machine, it seemed, much more a machine than a man. Vague relics of flesh and muscle remained in the skeletal fabric of his mechanical body, a fabulously wrought armature of gold and steel. "Who is that?" Loken whispered. "Regulus," Aximand replied curtly. "Adepts of the mechanicum." So that was what a mechanicum adept looked like, Loken thought. That was the sort of being who could command the invincible titans into war. "Hush now," Torgadon said, tapping Loken on the arm. Plated glass doors on the other side of the platform slid open, and laughter boomed out. A huge figure came out onto the strategium, talking and laughing animatedly, along with a diminutive presence who scuttled to keep up. Everybody dropped into a bow. Loken, going down on one knee, could hear the rustle of others bowing in the steep balconies above him. Boas Comnenus did so slowly, because his exoskeleton was ancient. Adept Regulus did so slowly, not because his machine body was stiff, but rather because he was clearly reluctant. War Master Horus looked around, smiled, and then leapt up onto the dais in a single bound. He stood at the center of the Auslight disk and turned slowly. "My friends," he said, "honor's done. Up you get." Slowly they rose and beheld him. He was as magnificent as ever, Loken thought. Massive and limber, a demigod manifest, wrapped in white gold armor and pelts of fur. His head was bare, shaven, sculptural. His face was noble, deeply tanned by multiple sunlights, his wide-spaced eyes bright, his teeth gleaming. He smiled and nodded to each and every one of them. He had such vitality, like a force of nature, a tornado, a tempest, an avalanche, trapped in humanoid form and distilled, the potential locked in. He rotated slowly on the dais, grinning, nodding to some, pointing out certain friends with a familiar laugh. The Primarch looked at Loken, back in the shadows of the overhang, and his smile seemed to broaden for a second. Loken felt a shudder of fear. It was pleasant and vigorous. Only the War Master could make an Astartes feel that. "Friends," Horus said. His voice was like honey, like steel, like a whisper. like all of those things, mixed as one. My dear friends and comrades of the 63rd Expedition, is it really that time again? Laughter rippled around the deck, and from the galleries above. Briefing time, Horus chuckled. And I salute you all for coming here to bear the tedium of yet another session. I promise I'll keep you no longer than is necessary. First, though. Horus jumped back down off the dais and stooped to place a sheltering arm around the tiny shoulders of the man who had accompanied him out of the inner chamber, like a father showing off a small child to his brothers. So embraced, the man fixed a stiff, sickly grin upon his face, more a desperate grimace than a show of pleasure. Before we begin, Horus said, I want to talk about my good friend Peter Egon Momus here. How humanity deserved an architect as fine and gifted as this, I don't know. Peter has been telling me about his designs for the new high city here, and they are wonderful. 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 Really, I don't know, my lord, Momus harumphed, his rictus trembling. The architect designate was beginning to shake, enduring direct exposure to such supreme attention. Our Lord the Emperor himself sent Peter to us, Horus told them. He knew his worth. You see, I don't want to conquer. Conquest of itself is so messy, isn't it, Ezekiel? Yes, Lord, Abaddon murmured. How can we draw the lost outposts of man back into one harmonious whole if all we bring them is conquest? We are duty-bound to leave them better than we found them, enlightened by the communication of the imperial truth and dazzlingly made over as august provinces of our wide estate. This expedition, and all expeditions, must look to the future and be mindful that what we leave in our wake must stand as an enduring statement of our intent, especially upon worlds as here, where we have been forced to inflict damage in the promulgation of our message. We must leave legacies behind us, imperial cities, monuments to the new age, and fitting memorials to those who have fallen in the struggle to establish it. Peter, my friend Peter here, understands this. I urge you all to take the time to visit his workshops and review his marvelous schemes, and I look forward to seeing the genius of his vision gracing all the new cities we build in the course of our crusade. Applause broke out. All the new cities? Momus coughed. Peter is the man for the job, Horus cried, ignoring the architect's muted gasp. I am at one with the way he perceives architecture as celebration. He understands, like no other, I believe, how the spirit of the crusade may be realized in steel and glass and stone. What we raise up is far more important than what we strike down. What we leave behind us men must admire for eternity and say, this was well done indeed. This is what the imperium means, and without it we would be shadows. For that, Peter's our man. Let's laud him now. A huge explosion of applause rang out across the vast chamber. Many officers in the command tiers below joined in. Peter Egon Momus looked slightly glazed as he was led off the strategium by an aide. Horus leapt back onto the dais. Let's begin. My worthy adept. Regulus stepped towards the edge of the dais and put a polished machine cog down delicately on the lip of the Auslight. When he spoke, his voice was augmented and inhuman, like an electric wind brushing through the boughs of steel trees. My lord Warmaster, the mechanicum is satisfied with this rock. We continue to study, with great interest, the technologies captured here. The gravitic and phasic weapons are being reversed engineered in our forges. At last report, 3 standard template construct patterns, previously unknown to us, have been recovered. Horus clapped his hands together. Glory to our brothers of the tireless mechanicum. Slowly we piece together the missing parts of humanity's knowledge. The Emperor will be delighted, as will, I'm sure, your Martian lords. Regulus nodded, lifting up the cog and stepping back from the dais. Horus looked around, Racris. My dear Racris. Lord Governor-elect Racris, a portly man in dove-grey robes, had already placed his sceptre wand on the edge of the dais to mark his participation. Now he fiddled with it as he made his report. Horus heard him out patiently, nodding encouragingly from time to time. Racris droned on at unnecessary length. Loken felt sorry for him. One of Lord Commander Varvarus's generals, Racris, had been selected to remain at 6319 as governor-overseer, marshalling the occupation forces as the world transmuted into a full imperial state. Racris was a career soldier, and it was clear that, though he took his election as a signal honour, he was quite aghast at the prospect of being left behind. He looked pale and ill, brooding on the time, not long away, when the expedition fleet left him to manage the work alone. Racris was Terran-born, and Loken knew that once the fleet sailed on and left him to his job, Racris would feel as abandoned as if he had been marooned. A governorship was intended to be the ultimate reward for a war hero's service, but it seemed to Loken a quietly terrible fate. To be monarch of a world and then cast away upon it. Forever. The Crusade would not be back to visit conquered worlds in a hurry.
"In truth, my commander," Racris was saying, "it may be many decades until this world achieves a state of equity with the imperium. There is great opposition."
"How far are we from compliance?" Horus asked, looking around. Varvarus replied. "True compliance, Lord?" "Decades. As my good friend Racris says, functional compliance. Well, that is different. There is a seed of dissidence in the southern hemisphere that we cannot quench. Until that is brought into line, this world cannot be certified." Horus nodded. "So, we stay here, if we must, until the job is done. We must hold over our plans to advance. Such a shame." The Primarch's smile faded for a second as he pondered. "Unless there is another suggestion." He looked at Abaddon and let the words hang. Abaddon seemed to hesitate and glanced quickly back into the shadows behind him. Loken realized that this was the question. This was a moment of council, when the Primarch looked outside the official hierarchy of the expedition's command echelon for the informal advice of his chosen inner circle. Torgadon nudged Loken, but the nudge was unnecessary. Loken had already stepped forward into the light behind Abaddon. "My Lord Warmaster," Loken said, almost startled by the sound of his own voice. "Captain Loken," Horus said, with a delighted flash of his eyes. "The thoughts of the Mournival are always welcome at my council." Several present, including Varvarus, made approving sounds. "My lord, the initial phase of the war here was undertaken quickly and cleanly," Loken said. "A surgical strike by the spear tip against the enemy's head to minimize the loss and hardship that both sides would suffer in a longer, full-scale offensive. A guerrilla war against insurgents would inevitably be an arduous, drawn-out, costly affair. It could last for years without resolution, eroding Lord Commander Varvarus's precious army resources and blighting any good beginning of the Lord Governor-elect's rule. 6319 cannot afford it, and neither can the expedition. I say, and if I speak out of turn, forgive me, I say that if the spear tip was meant to conquer this world in one clean blow, it has failed. The work is not yet done. Order the Legion to finish the job." Murmuring sprang up all around. "You'd have me unleash the lunar wolves again, Captain?" Horus asked. Loken shook his head. "Not the Legion as a whole, sir. 10th Company. We were first in, and for that we have been praised. But the praise was not deserved, for the job is not done." Horus nodded, as if quite taken with this. "Varvarus." "The army always welcomes the support of the noble Legion. The insurgent factions might plague my men for months, as the captain rightly points out, and make a great tally of killing before they are done with. A company of lunar wolves could crush them utterly and end their mutiny." "Racris?"
"An expedient solution would be a weight off my back, sir,"
Racris said. He smiled.
It would be a hammer to crush a nut, perhaps, but it would be emphatic. The work would be done, and quickly.
First Captain.
The Mournival speaks with one voice, Lord, Abaddon said. I urge for a swift conclusion to our business here, so that 6319 can get on with its life, and we can get on with the crusade.
So it shall be,
Horus said, smiling broadly again.
So, I make a command of it. Captain, have 10th Company drawn ready and oath to the moment. We will anticipate news of your success eagerly. Thank you for speaking your mind plainly, and for cutting to the quick of this thorny problem.
There was a firm flutter of approving applause.
Then, possibilities open for us after all, Horus said. We can begin to prepare for the next phase. When I signal him...
Horus looked at the blind mistress of astropaths, who nodded silently.
Our beloved Emperor will be delighted to learn that our portion of the crusade is about to advance again. We should now discuss the options open to us. I thought to brief you on our findings concerning these myself, but there is another who positively insists he is fit to do it.
Everyone present turned to look as the plate-glass doors slid open for a second time. The Primarch began to clap, and the applause gathered and swept around the galleries as Malagurst limped out onto the stage of the strategium. It was the equerry's first formal appearance since his recovery from the surface. Malagurst was a veteran lunar wolf, and a son of Horus to boot. He had been in his time a company captain, and might even have risen to the first captaincy had he not been promoted to the office of equerry. A shrewd and experienced soul, Malagurst's talent for intrigue and intelligence ideally served him in that role, and had long since earned him the title Twisted. He took no shame in this. The Legion might protect the War Master physically, but he protected him politically, guiding and advising, blocking and outplaying, aware and perfectly sensitive to every nuance and current in the expedition's hierarchy. He had never been well liked, though he was a hard man to get close to, even by the intimidating standards of the Astartes, and he had never made any particular effort to be liked. Most thought of him as a neutral power, a facilitator, loyal only to Horus himself. No one was ever foolish enough to underestimate him. But circumstance had suddenly made him popular. Beloved, almost. Believed dead, he had been found alive, and in the light of Sejanus's death, this had been taken as some compensation. The work of the remembrancer, Euphrates Keeler, had cemented his new role as the noble, wounded hero, as the pics of his unexpected rescue had flashed around the fleet. Now the assembly welcomed him back rapturously, cheering his fortitude and resolve. He had been reinvented through misfortune into an adored hero. Loken was quite sure Malagurst was aware of this ironic turn, and fully prepared to make the most of it. Malagurst came out into the open. His injuries had been so severe that he was not yet able to clothe himself in the armor of the Legion, and wore instead a white robe with the wolf's head emblem embroidered on the back. A gold signet in the shape of the War Master's icon, the staring eye, formed the cloak's clasp under his throat. He limped, and walked with the aid of a metal staff. His back bulged with a kyphotic misalignment. His face, drawn thin and pale since last it had been seen, was lined with effort, and waddings of synthetic skin gel covered gashes upon his throat and the left side of his head. Loken was shocked to see that he was now truly twisted. The old mocking nickname suddenly seemed crass and indelicate. Horus got down off the dais and threw his arms around his equerry. Varvarus and Abaddon both went over to greet him with warm embraces. Malagurst smiled and nodded to them, then nodded and waved up to the galleries around to acknowledge the welcome. As the applause abated, Malagurst leaned heavily against the side of the dais and placed his staff upon it in the ceremonial manner. Instead of returning to his place, the War Master stood back, away from the circle, giving his equerry center stage. "I have enjoyed," Malagurst began, his voice hard but brittle with effort, "a certain luxury of relaxation in these last few days." Laughter rattled out from all sides, and the clapping resumed for a moment. "Bed rest,"
Malagurst went on. "That bane of a warrior's life has suited me well, for it has given me ample opportunity to review the intelligence gathered in these last few months by our advanced scouts. However, bed rest, as a thing to be enjoyed, has its limits. I insisted that I be allowed to present this evidence to you today, for, Emperor bless me, never in my dreams did I imagine I would die of inaction." More approving laughter. Loken smiled. Malagurst really was making the best use of his new status amongst them. He was almost likable. "To review," Malagurst said, taking out a control wand and gesturing with it briefly. "3 key areas are of interest to us at this juncture." His gestures activated the underdeck hololithic projectors, and shapes of solid light came into being above the strategium, projected so that all in the galleries could see them. The first was a rotating image of the world they orbited, surrounded by graphic indicators of elliptical alignment and precession. The spinning world shrank rapidly until it became part of a system arrangement, similarly draped in schematic overlays, a turning 3-dimensional orrery suspended in the air. Then that too shrank and became a small, highlighted component in a mosaic of stars. "First," Malagurst said, "this area here, itemized 85817, the cluster adjacent to our current locale." A particular stellar neighborhood on the light map glowed. "Our most obvious and accessible next port of call. Scout ships report 18 systems of interest, 12 of which promise fundamental worth in terms of elemental resource, but no sign of life or habitation. The searches are not yet conclusive, but at this early juncture might I be so bold as to suggest that this region need not concern the expedition. Subject to certification, these systems should be added to the manifest of the colonial pioneers who follow in our footsteps." He waved the wand again, and a different group of stars lit up. "This second region, estimated as... Master?" Boas Comnenus cleared his throat and obligingly said, 9 weeks standard travel time to spinward of us, equerry." 9 weeks to spinward, thank you," Malagurst replied. "We have barely begun to scout this district, but there are early indications that some significant culture or cultures of interstellar capability exist within its bounds." "Currently functioning?" Abaddon asked. Too often, Imperial expeditions came upon the dry traces of long-perished societies in the desert of stars. "Too early to tell, First Captain," Malagurst said, "though the scouts report some discovered relics bear similarities to those we found on 79315 half a decade ago." "So, not human?" Adept Regulus asked. "Too early to tell, sir," Malagurst repeated. "The region has an itemization code, but I believe you'll all be interested to hear that it bears an old Terran name. Sagittarius." "The dreadful Sagittary," Horus whispered, with a delighted grin. "Quite so, my lord. The region certainly requires further examination." The crippled equerry moved the wand again and brought up a third coil of suns. "Our third option, further to spinward." 18 weeks, standard. Boas Comnenus supplied before he had to be asked. "Thank you, Master. Our scouts have yet to examine it, but we have received word from the 140th expedition commanded by Ketus Frome of the Blood Angels that opposition to Imperial advance has been encountered there. Reports are patchy, but war has broken out." "Human resistance?" Varvarus asked. "Are we talking about lost colonies?" "Xenos, sir," Malagurst said, succinctly. "Alien foes of some capacity. I have sent a missive to the 140th asking if they require our support at this time. It is significantly smaller than ours. No reply has yet been received. We may consider it a priority to venture forward to this region to reinforce the Imperial presence there." For the first time since the briefing began, the smile had left the War Master's face. "I will speak with my brother Sanguinius on this matter," he said. "I would not see his men perish unsupported." He looked at Malagurst.
Thank you for this, Equerry. We appreciate your efforts and the brevity of your summation.
There was a ripple of applause. One last thing, my lord, Malagurst said. A personal matter I wish to clear up. I have become known, so I understand, as Malagurst the Twisted, for reasons of character that I know are not lost on any present. I have always rejoiced in the title, though some of you might think that odd. I relish the arts politic, and make no effort to hide that. Some of my aides, as I have learned, have made efforts to have the sobriquet quashed, believing it offends my altered state. They worry that I might find it cruel. A slur. I want all here assembled to know that I do not. My body is broken, but my mind is not. I would take offence if the name was to be dropped out of politeness. I don't value sympathy much, and I don't want pity. I am twisted in body now, but I am still complex in mind. Don't think you are somehow sparing my feelings. I wish to be known as I always was. Well said, Abaddon cried, and smacked his palms together. The assembly rose in a tumult, as brisk as the one that had ushered Malagurst onto the stage. The equerry picked up his staff from the dais and, leaning upon it, turned to the War Master. Horus raised both hands to restore quiet.
Our thanks to Malagurst for presenting these options to us. There is much to consider. I dissolve this briefing now, but I request policy suggestions and remarks to my attention in the next day, ship time. I urge you to study all possibilities and present your assessments. We will reconvene the day after tomorrow at this time. That is all.
The meeting broke up. As the upper galleries emptied, buzzing with chatter, the parties on the strategium deck gathered in informal conference. The War Master stood in quiet conversation with Malagurst and the mechanicum adept.
Nicely done,
Torgadden whispered to Loken. Loken breathed out. He hadn't realized what a weight of tension had built up in him since his summons to the briefing had arrived.
Yes, finely put,
said Aximand.
I approve your commentary, Garviel. I just said what I felt. I made it up as I went along, Loken admitted.
Aximand frowned at him, as if not sure whether he was joking or not.
Are you not cowed by these circumstances, Horus? Loken asked.
At first, I suppose I must have been, Aximand replied in an offhand way. You get used to it, once you've been through one or two. I found it was helpful to look at his feet.
His feet?
The War Master's feet. Catch his eye and you'll quite forget what you were going to say.
Aximand smiled slightly. It was the first hint of any softening towards Loken that little Horus had shown.
Thanks. I remember that.
Abaddon joined them under the shadow of the overhang. I knew we'd picked right, he said, clasping Loken's hand in his own. Cut to the quick. That's what the War Master wants of us. A clean appraisal. Good job, Garviel. Now, just make sure it's a good job.
I will.
Need any help?
I can lend you the Justerin if you need them.
Thank you, but 10th can do this.
Abaddon nodded.
I'll tell Fulcus his Widowmakers are superfluous to requirements.
Please don't do that, Loken snapped, alarmed at the prospect of insulting Fulcus Kebra, captain of First Company's Terminator Elite. The other 3/4 of the Mournival laughed out loud.
Your face,
said Torgadden.
Ezekiel goads you so easily,
chuckled Aximand.
Ezekiel knows he will develop a tough skin soon enough,
Abaddon remarked.
Captain Loken,
Lord Governor-elect Rakris was approaching them. Abaddon, Aximand, and Torgadden stood aside to let him through.
Captain Loken, Rakris said, I just wanted to say, sir, how grateful I was to take this matter upon yourself and your company, to speak out so very directly. Lord Varvarus's soldiers are trying their best, but they are just men. The regime here is doomed unless firm action is taken.
10th Company will deal with the problem, Lord Governor, Loken said. You have my word, as an Astartes.
Because the army can't hack it. They looked around and found that the tall, princely figure of Lord Commander Varvarus had joined them too.
I didn't mean to suggest...
Racris blithered.
No offence was intended, Lord Commander,
said Loken. And none taken, Varus said, extending a hand towards Loken.
An old custom of terror, Captain Loken.
Loken took his hand and shook it.
One I have been reminded of lately, he said.
Varus smiled.
I wanted to welcome you into our inner circle, Captain, and to assure you that you did not speak out of turn today. In the south, my men are being slaughtered, day in, day out. I have, I believe, the finest army in all of the expeditions, but I know full well it is composed of men, and just men. I understand when a fighting man is needed and when an Astartes is needed. This is the latter time. Come to my war cabinet, at your convenience, and I'll be happy to brief you fully.
Thank you, Lord Commander. I will attend you this afternoon.
Varus nodded.
Excuse me, Lord Commander, Togatten said. The Mournival is needed. The War Master is withdrawing, and he has called for us.
The Mournival followed the War Master through the plated glass doors into his private sanctum, a wide, well-appointed chamber built below the well of the audience galleries on the port side of the flagship. One wall was glass, open to the stars. Malagurst and the War Master bustled in ahead of them, and the Mournival drew back into the shadows, waiting to be called upon. Loken stiffened as three figures descended the ironwork screw stair into the room from the gallery above. The first two were Astartes of the imperial fists, almost glowing in their yellow plate. The third was much larger. Another god. Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the imperial fists, brother to Horus. Dawn greeted the War Master warmly and went to sit with him and Malagurst upon the black leather couches facing the glass wall. Servitors brought them refreshments. Rogel Dawn was a being as great in all measure as Horus. He and his entourage of imperial fists had been travelling with the expedition for some months, though they were expected to take their leave soon. Other duties and expeditions called. Loken had been told that Primarch Dawn had come to them at Horus's behest, so that the two of them might discuss in detail the obligations and remit of the role of War Master. Horus had solicited the opinions and advice of all his brother Primarchs on the subject, since the honour had been bestowed upon him. Being named War Master set him abruptly apart from them, and raised him up above his brothers, and there had been some stifled objections and discontent, especially from those Primarchs who felt the title should have been theirs. The Primarchs were as prone to sibling rivalry and petty competition as any group of brothers. Guided, it was likely, by Malagurst's shrewd hand, Horus had courted his brothers, stilling fears, calming doubts, reaffirming pacts, and generally securing their cooperation. He wanted none to feel slighted or overlooked. He wanted none to think they were no longer listened to. Some, like Sanguinius, Lorgar, and Fulgrim, had acclaimed Horus's election from the outset. Others, like Angron and Perturabo, had raged biliously at the new order, and it had taken masterful diplomacy on the War Master's part to placate their choler and jealousy. A few, like Russ and the Lion, had been cynically resolved, unsurprised by the turn of events. But others, like Guilliman, Khan, and Dawn, had simply taken it in their stride, accepting the Emperor's decree as the right and obvious choice. Horus had ever been the brightest, the first, and the favourite. They did not doubt his fitness for the role, for none of the Primarchs had ever matched Horus's achievements, nor the intimacy of his bond with the Emperor. It was to these solid, resolved brothers that Horus turned in particular for counsel. Dawn and Guilliman both embodied the staunchest and most dedicated imperial qualities, commanding their legion expeditions with peerless devotion and military genius. Horus desired their approval as a young man might seek the quiescence of older, more accomplished brothers. Rogel Dawn possessed perhaps the finest military mind of all the Primarchs. It was as ordered and disciplined as Reboot Guilliman's, as courageous as the Lion's, yet still supple enough to allow for the flecks of inspiration, the flash of battle zeal that had won the likes of Leman Russ and the Khan so many victory wreaths. Dawn's record in the crusade was second only to Horus's, But he was resolute where Horus was flamboyant, reserved where Horus was charismatic, and that was why Horus had been the obvious choice for War Master. In keeping with his patient, stony character, Dawn's Legion had become renowned for siegecraft and defensive strategies. The War Master had once joked that where he could storm a fortress like no other, Rogel Dawn could hold it.
"If I ever laid assault to a bastion possessed by you," Horus had quipped at a recent banquet, "then the war would last for all eternity, the best in attack matched by the best in defense."
The Imperial fists were an immovable object to the Lunar Wolves' unstoppable force. Dawn had been a quiet, observing presence in his months with the 63rd Expedition. He had spent hours in close conference with the War Master, but Loken had seen him from time to time, watching drills and studying preparations for war. Loken had not yet spoken to him, or met him directly. This was the smallest place they had both been in at the same time. He regarded him now, in calm discussion with the War Master. Two mythical beings manifest in one room. Loken felt it an honor just to be in their presence, to see them talk, like men, in unguarded fashion. Malagurst seemed a tiny form beside them. Primarch Dawn wore a case of armor that was burnished and ornate like a tomb chest, dark red and copper gold compared to Horus's white dazzle. Unfurled eagle wings, fashioned in metal, haloed his head and decorated his chest and shoulder plate, and Aquila's engraven laurels embossed the armor sections of his limbs. A mantle of red velvet hung around his broad shoulders, trimmed in golden weave. His lean face was stern and unsmiling, even when the War Master raised a joke, and his hair was a shock of white, bleached like dead bones. The two Astartes who had escorted him down from the gallery came over to wait with the Mournival. They were well known to Abaddon, Torgadon and Aximand, but Loken had only yet seen them indirectly about the flagship. Abaddon introduced them as Sigismund, first captain of the Imperial Fists, resplendent in black and white heraldry, and Ifred, captain of the Third Company. The Astartes made the sign of the Aquila to one another in formal greeting.
"I approve of your direction," Sigismund told Loken at once. "I'm gratified. You are watching from the galleries?"
Sigismund nodded.
"Prosecute the foe. Get it over with. Get on. There is still so much to be done. We cannot afford delays or time wasting."
"There are so many worlds still to be brought to compliance," Loken agreed. "One day we will rest at last."
"No," Sigismund replied bluntly. "The crusade will never end. Don't you know that?"
Loken shook his head.
"I wouldn't." "Not ever," said Sigismund emphatically. "The more we spread, the more we find. World after world, new worlds to conquer. Space is limitless, and so is our appetite to master it."
"I disagree," Loken said. "War will end one day. A rule of peace will be established. That is the very purpose of our efforts."
Sigismund grinned. "Is it? Perhaps. I believe that we have set ourselves an unending task. The nature of mankind makes it so. There will always be another goal, another prospect." "Surely, brother, you can conceive of a time when all worlds have been brought into one unity of imperial rule. Isn't that the dream we strive to realize?"
Sigismund stared into Loken's face.
"Brother Loken, I have heard much about you, all of it good. I had not imagined I would discover such naivety in you. We will spend our lives fighting to secure this imperium, and then I fear we will spend the rest of our days fighting to keep it intact. There is such involving darkness amongst the stars. Even when the imperium is complete, there will be no peace. We will be obliged to fight on to preserve what we have fought to establish. Peace is a vain wish. Our crusade may one day adopt another name, but it will never truly end. In the far future, there will be only war."
"I think you're wrong," Loken said.
"How innocent you are,"
Sigismund mocked. "And I thought the Lunar Wolves were supposed to be the most aggressive of us all. That's how you like the other legions to think of you, isn't it? The most feared of mankind's warrior classes?"
Our reputation speaks for itself, sir, said Loken. As does the reputation of the Imperial Fists, Sigismund replied.
Are we going to scrap it out now? Argue which legion is toughest?
The answer, always, is the Wolves of Fenris, Torgadden put in, because they are clinically insane. He grinned broadly, sensing the tension, and wishing to dispel it. If you're comparing sane legions, of course, the question becomes more complex. Primarch Raboot's Ultramarines make a good show, but then there are so bloody many of them. The Word-Bearers, the White Scars, the Imperial Fists, oh, all have fine records. But the Lunar Wolves, me, the Lunar Wolves. Sigismund, in a straight fight, do you really think you'd have a hope? Honestly. Your yellow ragamuffins against the best of the best. Sigismund laughed. Whatever helps you sleep, Tarik. Terra bless us all, it is a paradigm that will never be tested. What Brother Sigismund isn't telling you, Garviel, Torgadden said, is that his legion is going to miss all the glory. It's to be withdrawn. He's quite miffed about it. Tarik is being selective with the truth, Sigismund snorted. The Imperial Fists have been commanded by the Emperor to return to Terra and establish a guard around him there. We are chosen as his praetorians. Now who's miffed, Lunar Wolf? Not I, said Torgadden. I'll be winning laurels in war while you grow fat and lazy minding the home fires. You're quitting the Crusade? Loken asked. I had heard something of this. The Emperor wishes us to fortify the Palace of Terra and guard its bulwarks. This was his word at the Ulanor Triumph. We have been the best part of 2 years tying up our business so we might comply with his desires. Yes, we're going home to Terra. Yes, we will sit out the rest of the Crusade, except that I believe there will be plenty of Crusade left once we have been given leave to quit Earth, our duty done. You won't finish this, Lunar Wolves. The stars will have long forgotten your name when the Imperial Fists war abroad again. Torgadden placed his hand on the hilt of his chainsword, playfully. Are you so keen to be slapped down by me for your insolence, Sigismund? I don't know. Is he? Rogel Dawn suddenly towered behind them. Does Sigismund deserve a slap, Captain Torgadden? Probably. In the spirit of comradeship, let him be. He bruises easily. All of them laughed at the Primarch's words. The barest hint of a smile flickered across Rogel Dawn's lips. Loken, he said, gesturing. Loken followed the massive Primarch to the far corner of the chamber. Behind them, Sigismund and Ifrid continued to sport with the others of the Mournival, and elsewhere Horus sat in intense conference with Malagurst. We are charged to return to the homeworld, Dawn said, conversationally. His voice was low and astonishingly soft, like the lap of water on a distant beach, but there was a strength running through it, like the tension of a steel cable. The Emperor has asked us to fortify the Imperial stronghold, and who am I to question the Emperor's needs? I am glad he recognizes the particular talents of the 7th Legion. Dawn looked down at Loken. You're not used to the likes of me, are you, Loken? No, Lord. I like that about you. Ezekiel and Tarik, men like them have been so long in the company of your Lord, they think nothing of it. You, however, understand that a Primarch is not like a man, or even an Astartes. I'm not talking about strength. I'm talking about the weight of responsibility. Yes, Lord. Dawn sighed. The Emperor has no like, Loken. There are no gods in this hollow universe to keep him company. So he made us, demigods, to stand beside him. I have never quite come to terms with my status. Does that surprise you? I see what I am capable of, and what is expected of me, and I shudder. The mere fact of me frightens me sometimes. Do you think your Lord Horus ever feels that way? I do not, Lord, Loken said. Self-confidence is one of his keenest qualities. I think so too, and I'm glad of it. There could be no better war master than Horus. But a man, even a Primarch, is only as good as the counsel he receives, especially if he is utterly self-confident. He must be tempered and guided by those close to him. You speak of the Mourneville, sir?
Rogel Dorn nodded. He gazed out through the armoured glass wall at the scintillating expanse of the starfield.
You know that I've had my eye on you, that I spoke in support of your election.
I have been told so, Lord. It baffles and flatters me.
My brother Horus needs an honest voice in his ear, a voice that appreciates the scale and import of our undertaking, a voice that is not blasé in the company of demigods. Sigismund and Efrit do this for me. They keep me honest. You should do the same for your lord.
I will endeavour to, Loken began.
They wanted Luke Sedire, or Yakton Cruz. Did you know that? Both names were considered. Sedire is a battle-hungry killer, so much like Abaddon. He would say yes to anything if it meant war glory. Cruz. You call him the half-herd, I'm told.
We do, Lord.
Cruz is a sycophant. He would say yes to anything if it meant he stayed in favor. The Mourneville needs a proper dissenting opinion.
A Naismith, Loken said. Dawn flashed a real smile.
Yes, just so. Like the old dynasts did. A Naismith. Your schooling's good. My brother Horus needs a voice of reason in his ear, if he is to rein in his eagerness and act in the Emperor's stead. Our other brothers, some of them quite demented by the choice of Horus, need to see he is firmly in control. So I vouched for you, Garviel Loken. I examined your record and your character, and thought you would be the right mix in the alloy of the Mourneville. Don't be insulted, but there is something very human about you, Loken, for an Astartes.
I fear, my lord, that my helm will no longer fit me. You have swelled my head so with your compliments. Dawn nodded.
My apologies.
You spoke of responsibility. I feel that weight suddenly. Terribly.
You're strong, Loken. Astartes built. Endure it.
I will, Lord. Dawn turned from the armoured port and looked down at Loken. He placed his great hands gently on Loken's shoulders.
Be yourself. Just be yourself. Speak your mind plainly, for you have been granted the rare opportunity to do so. I can return to Terra confident that the crusade is in safe hands.
I wonder if your faith in me is too much, Lord, Loken said. As fervent as Sedire, I have just proposed a war.
I heard you speak. You made the case well. That is all part of your role now. Sometimes you must advise. Sometimes you must allow the War Master to use you.
Use me?
You understand what Horus had you do this morning?
Lord?
He had primed the Mourneville to back him, Loken. He is cultivating the air of a peacemaker, for that plays well across the worlds of the Imperium. This morning, he wanted someone other than himself to suggest unleashing the legions for war.
7. Stay close, please, the iterator said. No one wander away from the group, and no one make any record beyond written notes without prior permission. Is that clear? They all answered yes. We have been granted 10 minutes, and that limit will be strictly observed. This is a real privilege. The iterator, a sallow man in his 30s called Emont, who despite his appearance possessed what Euphrates Keeler thought was a most beautiful speaking voice, paused and offered one last piece of advice to the group. This is also a hazardous place, a place of war. Watch your step, and be aware of where you are.
He turned and led them down the concourse to the massive blast hatch. The rattle of machine tools echoed out to them. This was an area of the ship the Remembrancers had never previously been allowed to visit. Most of the martial areas were off limits except by strict permission, but the embarkation deck was utterly forbidden at all times. There were 6 of them in the group. Keeler, another imagist called Simon Sark, a painter called Francisco Twell, a composer of symphonic patterns called Tomelo van Crasten, and 2 documentarianists called Avrius Carnis and Borodin Flora. Carnis and Flora were already bickering quietly about themes and approaches. All of the Remembrancers wore durable clothing appropriate for bad weather, and all carried kit bags. Keeler was fairly sure they'd all prepared in vain. The permission they hoped for would not be issued. They were lucky to get this far. She looped her own kit bag over her shoulder and settled her favourite picture unit around her neck on its strap. At the head of the party, Emont came to a halt before the 2 fully armoured lunar wolves standing watch at the hatch, and showed them the group's credentials.
"Approved by the equerry,"
she heard him say. In his beige robes, Emont was a fragile figure compared to the 2 armoured giants. He had to lift his head to look up at them. The Astartes studied the paperwork, made comments to one another in brief clicks of intersuit vox, and then nodded them through. The embarkation deck, and Keeler had to remind herself that this was just one embarkation deck, for the flagship possessed 6, was an immense space. A long, echoing tunnel dominated by the launch ramps and delivery trackways running its length. At the far end, half a kilometre away, open space was visible through the shimmer of integrity fields. The noise was punishing. Motorized tools hammered and ratcheted, hoists whined, loading units trundled and rattled, hatches slammed, and reactive engines whooped and flared as they were tested. There was activity everywhere. Deck crews hurrying into position, fitters and artificers making final checks and adjustments, servitors unlocking fuel lines. Munition carts hummed past in long sausage chains. The air stank of heat, oil and exhaust fumes. 6 Stormbirds sat on launch carriages before them. Heavy armoured delivery vehicles, they were void-capable, but also honed and sleek for atmospheric work. They sat in 2 rows of 3, wings extended, like hawks waiting to be thrown to the lure. They were painted white and showed the wolf's head icon and the eye of Horus on their hulls.
"Known as Stormbirds," the iterator was saying as he walked them forward. "The actual pattern type is Warhawk 6. Most expedition forces are now reliant on the smaller, standard construct Thunderhawk pattern, examples of which you can see under covers to our left in the hardstand area. But the Legion has made an effort to keep these old, heavy-duty machines in service. They have been delivering the Lunar Wolves into war since the start of the Great Crusade, since before that, actually. They were manufactured on Terra by the Indonesic bloc for use against the Pan-Pacific tribes during the Unification Wars. A dozen will be employed in this venture today, 6 from this deck, 6 from aft embarkation 2. Keeler raised her pictor and took several quick shots of the line of Stormbirds ahead. For the last, she crouched down to get a low, impressive angle down the row of their flared wings. "I said no records,"
Emont snapped, hurrying to her.
"I didn't think for a moment you were serious," Keeler responded smoothly. "We've got 10 minutes. I'm an imagist. What the hell did you think I was going to do?"
Emont looked flustered. He was about to say something when he noticed that Carnis and Flora were wandering astray, locked in some petty squabble.
"Stay with the group,"
Emont cried out, hurrying to shepherd them back.
"Get anything good?"
Sark asked Keeler.
"Please, it's me," she replied.
He laughed and took out a picture of his own from his rucksack.
"I didn't have the balls, but you're right. What the hell are we doing here if not our job?"
He took a few shots. Keeler liked Sark. He was good company and had a decent track record of work on Terra. She doubted he would get much here. His eye for composition was fine when it came to faces, but this was very much her thing. Both the documentarists had now cornered Emont and were grilling him with questions that he struggled to answer. Keeler wondered where Mercedes Ollerton had got to. Competition amongst the remembrancers for these 6 places had been fierce, and Mercedes had won a slot thanks to Keeler's good word and, it was said, approval from someone high up in the Legion. But she had failed to show up on time that morning, and her place had been taken at the last minute by Borodin Flora. Ignoring the iterator's instructions, she moved away from the group and chased images with her pictor. The lunar wolf emblem stenciled on an erect braking flap. 2 servitors glistening with lubricant as they struggled to fix a faulty feed. Deck crew panting and wiping sweat from their brows beside a munition trolley they had just loaded. The bare metal snout of an underwing cannon.
"Are you trying to get me replaced?"
Emont asked, catching up with her.
"No. I really must ask you to keep in line, madam," he said. "I know you're in favour, but there is a limit. After that business on the surface." "What business?" she asked. "A couple of days ago, surely you heard?" "No." "Some remembrancer gave his minders the slip during a surface visit and got into a deal of trouble. Quite a scandal. It's annoyed the higher-ups. The primary iterator had to wrangle hard to prevent the remembrancer contingent being suspended from activity." "Was it that bad?" "I don't know the details. Please, for me, stay in line." "You have a very lovely voice," Keeler said. "You could ask me to do anything. Of course I will."
Emont blushed.
"Let's continue with the visit."
As he turned, she took another pict, capturing the scruffy iterator, head down, against a backdrop of bustling crewmen and threatening ships.
"Iterator," she called, "have we been granted permission to accompany the drop?"
"I don't believe so," he said sadly.
"I'm sorry. I've not been told."
A fanfare boomed out across the vast deck. Keeler heard and felt a beat like a heavy drum, like a war hammer striking again and again against metal.
"Come to one side. Now, to one side,"
Emont called, trying to gather the group on the edge of the deck space. The drumming grew closer and louder. It was feet. Steel-shod feet marching across decking. 300 Astartes, in full armor and marching perfectly in step, advanced onto the embarkation deck between the waiting stormbirds. At the front of them, a standard-bearer carried the great banner of the 10th Company. Keeler gasped at the sight of them. So many, so perfect, so huge, so regimented. She raised her pictor with trembling hands and began to shoot. Giants in white metal, assembling for war, uniform and identical, precise and composed. Orders flew out, and the Astartes came to a halt with a crashing din of heels. They became statues as equerries hurried through their files, directing and assigning men to their carriers. Smoothly, units began to turn in fluid sequence and filed onto the waiting vessels.
"They will have already taken their oaths of moment,"
Emont was saying to the group in a hushed whisper. "Explain," Van Crasten requested. Emont nodded.
"Every soldier of the Imperium is sworn to uphold his loyalty to the Emperor at the start of his commission, and the Astartes are no exception. No one doubts their continued devotion to the pledge, but before individual missions, the Astartes choose to swear an immediate oath, an oath of moment, that binds them specifically to the matter at hand. They pledge to uphold the particular concerns of the enterprise before them. You may think of it as a reaffirmation, I suppose." "It is a ritual re-pledging. The Astartes do love their rituals."
"I don't understand," said Van Crasten. "They are already sworn, but—"
"To uphold the truth of the Imperium and the light of the Emperor," Emont said. "But, as the name suggests, an oath of moment applies to an individual action. It is specific and precise."
Van Crasten nodded. "Who's that?" Twell asked, pointing. A senior Astartes, a captain by his cloak, was walking the lines of warriors as they streamed neatly onto the dropships.
"That's Loken,"
Emont said. Keeler raised her pictor. Loken's comb-crested helm was off. His fair-cropped hair framed his pale, freckled face. His grey eyes seemed immense. Mercedy had spoken to her of Loken. Quite a force now, if the rumours were true. One of the four. She shot him speaking to a subordinate, and again waving servitors clear of a landing ramp. He was the most extraordinary subject. She didn't have to compose around him, or shoot to crop later. He dominated every frame. No wonder Mercedy was so taken with him. Keeler wondered again why Mercedy Oliton had missed this chance. Now Loken turned away, his men all but boarded. He spoke with the standard-bearer and touched the hem of the banner with affection. Another fine shot. Then he swung round to face 5 armoured figures approaching across the suddenly empty deck.
"This is,"
Emont whispered.
"this is quite something. I hope you all understand you're lucky to see this."
"See what?" asked Sark.
"The captain takes his oath of moment last of all. It will be heard and sworn to by 2 of his fellow captains, but, oh my goodness, the rest of the Mournival have come to hear him pledge." "That's the Mournival?"
Keeler asked, her pictor shooting.
"First Captain Abaddon, Captain Torgadon, Captain Aximand, and with them Captain Cedere and Targost."
Emont breathed, afraid of raising his voice.
"Which one is Abaddon?"
Keeler asked, aiming her pictor. Loken knelt.
"There was no need,"
he began.
"We wanted to do this right,"
Torgadon replied. "Luke?" Luke Cedere, captain of the 13th Company, took out the seal paper on which the oath of moment was written.
"I am sent to hear you,"
he said.
"And I am here to witness it,"
Targost said.
"And we are here to keep you cheerful,"
Torgadon added. Abaddon and little Horus chuckled. Neither Targost nor Cedere were sons of Horus. Targost, captain of the 7th, was a blunt-faced man with a deep scar across his brow. Luke Cedere, champion of so many wars, was a smiling rogue, blond and handsome, his eyes blue and bright, his mouth permanently half open, as if about to bite something. Cedere raised the scrap of parchment. "Do you, Garviel Loken, accept your role in this? Do you promise to lead your men into the zone of war, and conduct them to glory, no matter the ferocity or ingenuity of the foe? Do you swear to crush the insurgents of 6319, despite all they might throw at you? Do you pledge to do honor to the 16th Legion and the Emperor?" Loken placed his hand on the bolter Targost held out.
"On this matter, and by this weapon, I swear."
Cedere nodded and handed the oath paper to Loken.
"Kill for the living, brother," he said, "and kill for the dead."
He turned to walk away. Targost holstered his bolter, made the sign of the Aquila, and followed him. Loken rose to his feet, securing his oath paper to the rim of his right shoulder guard.
"Do this right,
Garviel," Abaddon said.
"I'm glad you told me that,"
Loken deadpanned.
"I've been considering making a mess of it."
Abaddon hesitated, wrong-footed. Torgadon and Aximand laughed.
"He's growing that thick skin already, Ezekiel."
Aximand sniggered.
"You walked into that,"
Torgadon added.
I know,"
Abaddon snapped. He glared at Loken.
"Don't let the commander down."
"Would I?" Loken replied, and walked away to his Stormbird. "Our time's up," Emont said. Keeler didn't care. That last pick had been exceptional. The Mournival, Cedere, and Targost, all in a solemn group. Loken on his knees. Emont conducted the remembrances out of the embarkation deck space to an observation deck, adjacent to the launch port from which they could watch the Stormbirds deploy. They could hear the rising note of the Stormbird engines behind them, trembling the embarkation deck as they fired up in pre-launch test. The roaring dulled away as they walked down the long access tunnel, hatches closing one by one after them. The observation deck was a long chamber, one side of which was a frame of armoured glass. The deck's internal lighting had been switched low so that they could better see into the darkness outside. It was an impressive view. They directly overlooked the yawning maw of the embarkation deck, a colossal hatch ringing with winking guide lights. The bulk of the flagship rose away above them, like a crenellated Gothic city. Beyond lay the void itself. Small service craft and cargo landers flitted past, some on local business, some heading out to other ships of the expedition fleet. 5 of these could be seen from the observation deck, sleek monsters at high anchor several kilometers away. They were virtual silhouettes, but the distant sun caught them obliquely and gave them hard, golden outlines along their ribbed upper hulls. Below lay the world they orbited, 6319. They were above its night side, but there was a smoky grey crescent of radiance where the Terminator crept forward. In the dark mass, Keeler could make out the faint light glow of cities speckling the sleeping surface. Impressive though the view was, she knew shots would be a waste of time. Between the glass, the distance, and the odd light sources, resolution would be poor. She found a seat away from the others and began to review the pics she'd already taken, calling them up on the Pictor's view screen. "May I see?" asked her voice. She looked up and had to peer in the deck's gloom to identify the speaker. It was Cinderman, the primary iterator. "Of course," she said, rising to her feet and holding the Pictor so he could see the images as she thumbed them up one by one. He craned his head forward, curious. "You have a wonderful eye, Mistress Keeler. Oh, that one is particularly fine. The crew working so hard. I find it striking because it is so natural, candid, I suppose. So very much of our pictorial record is arch and formally posed. I like to get people when they're not aware of me. This one is simply magnificent. You've captured Garville perfectly there." "You know him personally, sir?" "Why do you ask?" "You called him by his forename, not by any honorific or rank." Cinderman smiled at her. "I think Captain Loken might be considered a friend of mine. I'd like to think so, anyway. You never can tell with an Astartes. They form relationships with mortals in a curious way, but we spend time together and discuss certain matters." "You're his mentor?" "His tutor. There is a great difference. I know things he does not, so I am able to expand his knowledge, but I do not presume to have influence over him. Oh, Mistress Keeler, this one is superb. The best, I should say." "I thought so. I was very pleased with it." "All of them together like that, and Garville kneeling so humbly, and the way you framed them against the company's standard." "That was just happenstance," Keeler said. "They chose what they were standing beside." Cinderman placed his hand gently upon hers. He seemed genuinely grateful for the chance to review her work. "That pict alone will become famous, I have no doubt. It will be reproduced in history text for as long as the Imperium endures." "It's just a pict," she chided. "It is a witness. It is a perfect example of what the remembrances can do. I have been reviewing some of the material produced by the remembrances thus far, the material that's been added to the expedition's collective archive. Some of it is patchy, shall I say. Ideal ammunition for those who claim the Remembrancer project is a waste of time, funds, and ship space. But some is outstanding, and I would class your work amongst that." "You're very kind." "I am honest, mistress, and I believe that if mankind does not properly document and witness his achievements, then only half of this undertaking has been made. Speaking of honest, come with me." He led her back to the main group by the window. Another figure had joined them on the observation deck and stood talking to Van Carsten. It was the equerry, Malakhurst, and he turned as they approached. "Kirill, do you want to tell them?" "You engineered it, equerry. The pleasure's yours." Malakhurst nodded. "After some negotiation with the expedition seniors, it has been agreed that the 6 of you can follow the strike force to the surface and observe the venture. You will travel down with one of the ancillary support vessels." The remembrancers chorused their delight. "There's been a lot of debate about allowing remembrances to become embedded in the layers of military activity," Cinderman said. particularly concerning the issue of civilian welfare in a war zone. There is also, if I may be quite frank, some concern about what you will see. The Astartes in war is a shocking, savage sight. Many believe that such images are not for public distribution, as they might paint a negative picture of the Crusade. We both believe otherwise, Malachus said. The truth can't be wrong, even if it is ugly or shocking. We need to be clear about what we are doing and how we are doing it, and allow persons such as yourselves to respond to it. That is the honesty on which a mature culture must be based. We also need to celebrate, and how can you celebrate the courage of the Astartes if you don't see it? I believe in the strength of positive propaganda, thanks in no small part to Mistress Keeler here and her documenting of my own plight. There is a rallying power in images and reports of both imperial victory and imperial suffering. It communicates a common cause to bind and uplift our society. It helps, Cinderman put in, that this is a low-key action, an unusual use of the Astartes in a policing role. It should be over in a day or so, with little collateral risk. However, I wish to emphasize that this is still dangerous. You will observe instruction at all times and never stray from your protection detail. I am to accompany you. This was one of the stipulations made by the War Master. Listen to me, and do as I say at all times. So, we're still to be vetted and controlled, Keeler thought. Shown only what they choose to show us. Never mind. This is still a great opportunity. One that I can't believe Mercedy has missed. "Look!" cried Borodin Flora. They all turned. The storm birds were launching. Like giant steel darts they shot from the deck mouth, the sunlight catching their armored flanks. Majestically, they turned in the darkness as they fell away, burners lighting up like blue coals as they dropped in formation towards the planet. Bracing himself against the low overhead handrails, Loken moved down the spinal aisle of the lead stormbird. Lunar wolves, impassive behind their visors, their weapons locked and stowed, sat in the rear-facing cage seats either side of him. The bird rocked and shuddered as it cut its steep path through the upper atmosphere. He reached the cockpit section and wrenched open the hatch to enter. 2 flight officers sat back to back, facing wall-panel consoles, and beyond them 2 pilot servitors lay, hard-wired into forward-facing helm positions in the cone. The cockpit was dark, apart from the coloured glow of the instrumentation and the sheen of light coming in through the forward slit ports. "Captain," one of the flight officers said, turning and looking up. "What's the problem with the Vox?" Loken asked. "I've had several reports of comm faults from the men, ghosting and chatter." "We're getting that too, sir," the officer said, his hands playing over his controls. "And I'm hearing similar reports from the other birds. We think it's atmospherics." "Disruption?" "Yes, sir. I've checked with the flagship, and they haven't picked up on it. It's probably an acoustic echo from the surface." "It seems to be getting worse," Loken said. He adjusted his helm and tried his link again. The static hiss was still there, but now it had shapes in it, like muffled words. "Is that language?" he asked. The officer shook his head. "Can't tell, sir. It's just reading as general interference. Perhaps we're bouncing up broadcasts from one of the southern cities, or maybe even army traffic." "We need clean Vox," Loken said. "Do something." The officer shrugged and adjusted several dials. "I can try purging the signal. I can wash it through the signal buffers. Maybe that will tidy up the channels." In Loken's ears there was a sudden seething rush of static, and then things became quieter suddenly. "Better," he said. Then he paused. Now the hiss was gone. He could hear the voice. It was tiny, distant, impossibly quiet, but it was speaking proper words. "Only name you'll hear." "What is that?" Loken asked. He strained to hear. The voice was so very far away, like a rustle of silk. The flight officer craned his neck, listening to his own headphones. He made minute adjustments to his dials. "I might be able to," he began. A touch of his hand had suddenly cleaned the signal to audibility.
What in the name of terror is that? He asked.
Loken listened. The voice, like a gust of dry desert wind, said,
Summers. That's the only name you'll hear. Summers. It means the end and the death. Summers. I am Summers. Summers is all around you. Summers is the man beside you. Summers will gnaw upon your bones. Look out. Summers is here.
The voice faded. The channel went dead and quiet, except the occasional echo pop. The flight officer took off his headset and looked at Loken. His face was wide-eyed and fearful. Loken recoiled slightly. He wasn't made to deal with fear. The concept disgusted him.
I don't know what that was,
the flight officer said.
I do, said Loken. Our enemy is trying to scare us.
8. Following the Emperor's death and the fall of their ancient centralized government, the insurgents had fled into the mountain massifs of the southern hemisphere and occupied a fastness in a range of peaks, called the Whisperheads in the local language. The air was thin, for the altitude was very great. Dawn was coming up, and the mountains loomed as stern, misty steeples of pale green ice that reflected sun glare. The storm birds dropped from the edge of space,